Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Lamba from the University of Frankfurt, and I'll present some of the first impressions that I and my colleague Kai Oppermann from the Technical University of Chemnitz have gathered from an analysis of narratives of digital sovereignty in Germany. We are only just starting out on this project, so these are very much unformed thoughts, and we're looking for feedback, what you think about it. Now, we're both political scientists, and political science doesn't have a lot to say about the digital, but more about sovereignty. Sovereignty has become quite a contested term, especially over the past 30 years, where we've noticed that traditional conceptions of sovereignty, either popular sovereignty or state sovereignty, don't apply very well to a situation that's characterized by interdependence, by globalization, by transnational linkages among societies. And that's sort of the starting point for us, approaching sovereignty, and in this case digital sovereignty, as a term that is contested. And that's why we think of it as an object of discourse. As most political concepts, digital sovereignty is nothing that can be objectively measured. I mean, you can use proxies, you can think about observable implications, but that's not what we want to do. Instead, we're asking how digital sovereignty is being talked about. So how and why do political actors talk about the digital in terms of sovereignty? And we're doing this as a narrative analysis with the aim of reconstructing narrative structures of digital sovereignty in the German political sphere, where the term has become a pretty central item over the past few years. And we're asking, what do people mean by digital sovereignty? How do they present it? How do they sell it? And to that end, we read a lot of policy papers, strategy papers, speeches, interviews by ministries, think tanks, and from industry. Now, we do this in terms of narrative rather than discourse. I mean, there's not a lot of difference between the two, ontologically or epistemologically. Both of these approaches look at how the social world is constructed and shaped through language, but they have different emphases. Narrative analysis focuses on storytelling, and narratives provide structures to discursive objects, I would say. So it's a bit less about sort of unearthing the power structures and the hidden meanings behind discourse, but more about how issues are framed in political communication. Narrative analysis sort of disentangles narratives into three elements: setting, characters, and plot. Setting refers to the context in which the plot occurs, and in this case it's not sort of a physical location, but more the larger social context of digitalization or the digital transformation. And this can be both positive and negative. So a positive narrative would emphasize the opportunities that arise from digitalization, whereas a more negative narrative would emphasize the threats, the risks, and the challenges that arise therefrom. Now, characters can occupy different roles: subjects, agents, and antagonists. The subjects are the holders of digital sovereignty, if you will. And here we sort of follow what Julia Pohle has been writing, and distinguish three kinds of subjects. These are citizens, private companies, and then there are public actors / the state / society. Similarly, for the agents of digital sovereignty, i.e. those characters who create or safeguard digital sovereignty, these are basically the same, so citizens, private companies, and public actors. And thirdly, the antagonists. So who are the threats to our, in air quotes, digital sovereignty? These are typically only alluded to. Sometimes you do see specific mentions, but it's sort of commonsensical that this refers to the big companies like Facebook and Google, or China, or maybe the NSA. Now the third element is the plot, and this sort of ties the setting and the characters together into a narrative structure, and offers answers to questions like, what is digital sovereignty? How should it be achieved? How do we know it when we have it? So actors propose definitions through narrative, and also offer recommendations what should be done to achieve it. And there are various measures being floated in the pursuit of digital sovereignty, like improving data protection, other kinds of regulation, improving competitiveness and innovation capabilities in industry, cooperating in Europe, education, and others. And our impression is that the way narratives around digital sovereignty are being spun is reminiscent of that of a fable or a parable. In other words, didactic stories of threatened innocence. These narratives say that Germany, and by extension Europe, is threatened by the forces of digitalization and is losing, or has already lost, the ability to shape its own destiny. But if the country reforms and sees the light of digital sovereignty, will it be able to escape this fate? And my personal impression, and this is a bit of an aside, is that this reminds me a lot of narratives of globalization in the 1990s, which were similarly framed as a tale of threat and redemption. Now, looking at it in slightly more depth, we ask, if digital sovereignty is the solution, what's the problem it is supposed to address? And our impression is that it's supposed to solve all of them. So beyond this large-scale tale of change and adaptation, the meanings attached to the concept of digital sovereignty are pretty complex. So our preliminary results suggest that digital sovereignty as a concept is inscribed with a broad variety of different meanings, and also attached to different subjects, agents, and antagonists. For example, economic policy actors frame digital sovereignty in terms of the competitiveness of German and European digital industries in a global marketplace that is dominated by US companies and Chinese companies. The legal policy community views it through the prism of data protection, and they speak a lot about the sovereignty of the individual to have control over their own data, and how this is threatened by big companies seeking to monetize and control that data. Then there are the security communities, external and domestic, who portray digital sovereignty as the capability to manage vulnerabilities in critical infrastructures and limit dependencies in key industries. Now, all of these talk about this in terms of digital sovereignty, and for everyone, digital sovereignty is presented as being the solution to their specific problem. And there are more ways of approaching this. There are debates in public procurement. You see a lot of debates about open source infrastructure and how it should be used for communal, local level administration instead of commercial products. There are debates surrounding critical media literacy in schools that are also framed in terms of digital sovereignty. And this is why I refer to the whole discourse and narrative of digital sovereignty as multivitamin juice in an empty signifier. Empty signifier, you're probably aware of that. It's basically a word without an actual meaning. And the multivitamin juice of digital sovereignty is characterized by two things. First of all, it's a blend of different things. Loads and loads of fruits are blended together. And secondly, it's good for you. And this is what digital sovereignty reminds me of. Hence, defining digital sovereignty in German political discourse is almost impossible. Now, it's not that people aren't trying. quite the contrary. Basically, everyone is putting forward their own definition, and the federal government is also doing its part to sort of structure approaches a little bit and moving towards a concerted effort, not least by championing the concept in European policy debates. But all of this doesn't really help us really get towards a core of a meaning, because all these definitions diverge quite substantially. Now, one might see this as a conceptual weakness, but it's not a bug. We think it's a feature. Because narratives of digital sovereignty are very useful for organizing domestic political coalitions. It's very easy to construct a kind of superficial alliance between different policy communities with slightly overlapping concerns. The economic policy makers can agree to that, the legal policy community can agree to that, the security community can agree to that, as long as the meaning is not fixed too rigidly. And that means that everyone can sort of rebrand their concerns in terms of digital sovereignty. So the data protection people who have been banging the drum of data protection for a long time, and whose concerns are completely valid and genuine, see value in rebranding their approach in terms of digital sovereignty, because that's the language that gets political attention, that gets the money, and so on. The sovereignty frame is quite useful for that, because who's against sovereignty? Who should want to speak out against that? So it's quite useful to organize political alliances between different communities. Now, this is sort of where the problem emerges, because as useful as this narrative is for domestic debates, it seems to have certain weaknesses when you try to apply it elsewhere. In other words, the concept doesn't travel very well. And we can see this in two levels, the European and the global level. And now at the European level, the federal government of Germany has been pretty interested in pushing the concept into European debates, very prominently during the ongoing rotating presidency of the European Council, but also before that. But here it pretty clearly competes with other more established concepts like technological sovereignty or strategic autonomy and so on. And it doesn't actually provide a very compelling argument why people should talk about these issues in terms of digital sovereignty rather than these other frames. At the global level, this is even more problematic because when you speak of digital sovereignty in contexts where you have especially North American counterparts, they get quite suspicious about it, because it reminds them of narratives of internet sovereignty, cyber sovereignty, information sovereignty, or information security emanating from China and Russia. And these are quite clearly very different, but by using the sovereignty frame, it's kind of understandable how these narratives can get entangled sort of in the minds of listeners. And this is why the government has been quite hesitant of pushing this narrative too hard in debates about global internet governance. And that's where we're at the moment. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any comments, I'd be happy to hear them, or if something occurs to you later on, please do get in touch, and I look forward to our discussion.